Welcome to Oh God, What Now, the podcast that will not be annexing Greenland. Happy New Year, despite everything. I'm Dorian Lynskey. On today's show, we ask a question that should seem absurd, with Robert Jenrick channeling Enoch Powell and Kemi Badenoch endorsing Elon Musk's race-baiting conspiracy theories. Is the Tory party now even more tolerant of the far right than Nigel Farage's Reform UK? And what happens to Britain if the centre-right just gives up? Then, a new year brings new questions, so we're going to answer as many as we can from our Patreon backers in a But Your Email special. And in the extra bit for supporters, is January secretly brilliant? We debate the underrated virtues of the most unloved month. Let's meet today's panel. No spoilers, but first up is a man who hates January, author and columnist Jonn Elledge. Hi, Jonn.
Hi.
Now he hates me too. Jonn, someone who must also hate January, at least this year, is Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Why has he resigned?
Well, the short version is nobody likes him. His approval ratings are on the floor. He's been in office for 9 years, which is, it's a long time for anyone. He's done the classic centre-left thing of alienating the left without appealing to the right. There have been a couple of specific scandals. He accepted, his family have accepted some gifts, which is a common problem for centre-left prime ministers. In 2021, Canada held its first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, and the Prime Minister was surfing. My personal favourite is the time he couldn't remember how many times he's been to parties in blackface in his youth. But a lot of it's just the incumbency curse. It's like inflation has gone up. It's very, very hard for incumbents to stay. Also, Canadian friends of mine would specifically like me to point out it's because there's been quite a lot of immigration and a surprising number of Canadians are racist.
All of that would explain why his party would do badly in the forthcoming election. But I don't understand, why has he resigned? Does he just not want to... Because he didn't what Sunak didn't, which is just I don't want to do that. That's going to be an awful election.
I mean, so we're recording this on Wednesday. I think it's today. There was actually going to be sort of a summit meeting with his cabinet where they were basically going to go around the table and tell him to resign. So he kind of went now to sort of preempt that process. The election is due by October. Parliament has been dissolved, prorogued actually till March. The assumption is that the election will now be a bit earlier than October. So basically whoever takes over is kind of auditioning to be the new Kim Campbell, who fans of the Canadian 1993 election will recall was Prime Minister for, I think, 3 months before losing devastatingly. So I would expect to see something similar happen. That's everything I know about Canadian politics.
Who is not a fan of the 1993 Canadian election?
Oh, it was great.
The Taylor Swift of elections.
Did you know? Am I the only one who got obsessed with this in the run-up to last year's
because that was the one where the Conservatives got wiped out.
Yeah, they got 2 seats. It was incredible. So I was briefly upset. I say briefly, it's for about 8 months. I was obsessed with it.
Well, thank you for all your expertise. Next up, it's award-winning journalist Hannah Fearn. Hi, Hannah.
Hello.
Do you like that new introduction?
I do. Keep it in every time.
Good.
Thank you.
The NHS has a critical incident crisis every winter, with A&E departments overwhelmed and patients waiting in ambulances for hours. Is this year unusually bad?
It is slightly unusual. It's the same problem, but it is even worse. So 12 hospitals have declared critical incidents today. Actually, that was about an hour ago. It may be more by the time I'm sitting here. Many more are expected to follow this week. And the reason is that we're having a really severe flu crisis. So the problems with the NHS, we've talked about them loads of times. They're the same as they always are. But this year, we know that data from the Southern Hemisphere, was winter that recently concluded, showed that the flu jab just isn't working as effectively this year, and this can happen. Sometimes the coverage isn't as good as it should be, and so we've got a really big flu crisis on our hands, and it's due to get much worse next week as well, because there's about a week time lag post-Christmas and returning to school. So expect things to be very, very bad next week, sadly.
So is this a different evil kind of flu?
It's just that they guessed the strains wrong.
Term.
Yeah, evil kind of flu. They have to guess the strains, the ones that are going to be most predominant in each season, and unfortunately sometimes get it slightly wrong. It's educated guesses,
okay.
And sometimes one strain that isn't covered by the jab turns out to be more, spread faster and be more virulent than expected. So the average flu jab is about 50% coverage. That means it offers 50% prevention from hospitalisation. I'm not sure how they calculate that, but anyway, it's about 50% effective, and this one is about 35% effective. So of 100 people who get it who might expect to be hospitalised, only 35 are prevented from hospitalisation, not half. So, yeah, it's going to be bad, and all we can do really is don't go out if we've got it, wear masks if you've got it, try not to give it to your grandma.
Finally, you loved our guest so much last time that we simply had to ask her back. It's former editor of The Mirror, Alison Phillips. Hi, Alison.
Hello, it's lovely to see you all.
So there are weird scenes at Mark Zuckerberg's Meta. Nick Clegg has been replaced as Chief Global Affairs Officer by Trump-aligned Republican Joel Kaplan. Moderation of fact-checking departments have been gutted and relocated to Texas, and the definition of hate speech has been narrowed. So it's, if you want to be nasty to LGBTQ people, go for it. Is Zuck sucking up to Trump, or is this what he really wanted all along? That he just doesn't really, it's all just a big ball ache, moderation.
Well, it's probably a bit of both, but I absolutely think this is him sucking up to Trump. This is a man, you've got to remember, Zuckerberg, who after 4 years ago, when he thought that Trump wasn't going to be anywhere near power again, was more than happy to be looking at greater moderation. And I think yesterday, if you saw the video of him announcing these changes, which sort of did have sort of a tendency a bit like a hostage video, and he was sat there just saying exactly what he was been primed to say, I thought it was absolutely despicable. It's just absolutely gutless that he was going out there knowing what everybody would say and that he was doing this purely for Trump's attention at this point. And then I think the worst element of it was that when he essentially referred to the moderation that's been going on in the past few years as censorship, which I think just plays into all those concerns on the right, those populist ideas that the real news has been censored. I think it is absolutely despicable what he's done, and the idea that he's now going to try and out Musk, which is where he's going to go to. But to be honest, if you look at what is happening in the States at the moment, they are falling over themselves, the owners of these, both big tech and also the big publishers, to try and ingratiate themselves with the new president. So Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon, who also owns the Washington Post, has made $1 million donation to the inauguration fund, plus another $1 million. And he's still got the walkout of staff who were so angry that there was no prior to the election that they wouldn't come out in favour of one candidate or the other. You've got the owner of the LA Times is telling the editors that no editorial can be written unless it's been run past him first, and that for every one thing they write that's critical of Trump, they've got to write something that's positive. You've got it's absolutely everywhere. And then at the same time, you've got this week, I thought another interesting thing was that Apple here mashing up BBC stories through AI and then putting out absolute rubbish. These big tech operators do not give a toss about accuracy, truth, what ordinary people are reading. They are, as a result, they are trying to destroy our democracy.
Well, I think the problem, I mean, there's a lot of problems you've outlined there.
That's just a few.
Many. I hate it when they try and destroy democracy. But one of the simple fact is that Conservatives were moderated on Facebook more often because they lied more often. And when you kind of removed controls on disinformation, then that tended to favour the right. So the implication of this policy shift seems to be that reality has a liberal bias and that you have to kind of correct for that.
I think so. I mean, there are complexities here in that fact-checking, yes, hopefully it showed fact. But in terms of trying to shape people's opinions to get them to accept facts wasn't necessarily that effective. There's been quite a lot of research done.
Yeah.
It shows that all the fact-checking does is wind up the people who feel they've been corrected even more. And we know there's a sort of psychological bias that we all have, is that we don't like being told we're wrong. And so I think we all need to perhaps think about how we do communicate. And is it a case of winning every single argument, or do we want to try and win the outcomes? And I think how we communicate, particularly those people on the left, how we communicate in this sort of moving time towards populism, I think we need to be a bit more nuanced and clever about it.
So let's begin. Kemi Badenoch's Tory party has entered 2025 on a shriekingly right-wing note. In response to Elon Musk's new obsession with a child abuse scandal from a decade ago that he had clearly never heard of before, Shadow Justice Secretary Robert Jenrick summoned the spirit of Enoch Powell in a gruesome tweet. I'm just going to quote some of it for those people that don't know. This appalling affair is the final nail in the coffin for Liberals who still cling to the argument that Britain is an integration success story. Please do not clip this as if these are my words, by the way. The scandal started with the onset of mass migration, importing hundreds of thousands of people from alien cultures who possess medieval attitudes towards women brought us here, and after 30 years of this disastrous experiment, we now have entrenched sectarian voting blocks that make it electoral suicide for some MPs to confront this. Then he does not, but probably should mention rivers of blood, because that's where he's going. But whereas Edward Heath famously booted Enoch Powell from the front bench in 1968, Badenoch gave Jenrick the thumbs up under the guise of confronting difficult truths. So is mainstream conservatism collapsing into the arms of the far right? Hannah, the strongest response to this came from Samuel Kasumu, who used to advise the Tories on race issues. And he said, I think Robert Jenrick has the potential to be the most divisive person in our political history. Some of his words over the last 12 months may result in some people maybe even dying. He has the potential to incite hatred in ways that I have never seen. Quite strong. But Jenrick recently praised a racist far-right Twitter account called Inevitable West, which says things like raid the mosques, ban the Quran, carry out mass deportations. And Jenrick said he admired their work very much. Among other things. Do you think the earlier reading of Jenrick was that he was being opportunistic and that he was a fairly sort of Cameronite centrist Tory who'd seen an opening there? Another one went that he worked on immigration and felt that it wasn't really working and that this pushed him to the right. Or has he just self-radicalised in a way that we've seen where people just become more and more extreme?
So the thing that I've always found hardest to understand about Jenrick is that he and I are exactly the same age. And I know that sounds a bit silly, but I really struggle to understand how a teen of the 90s grew up in the same era as me, sees modern Britain in the way that is described in those words. I cannot understand it. And Kasumu is also of a similar generation. He's only about 5 years younger, and I think it's important to remember that he was a highly respected, he's not a radical ideas man coming in to kind of troubleshoot. He was a highly respected advisor to both Johnson and May. He was a really big part of the kind of, this kind of modern Tory party that did hold power for a very long time. And I think so he knows Jenrick, and he knows him, he's known him for longer, and he knows him better than those of us postulating from outside. And if he thinks that he is a dangerously radicalising individual, I think we have to really listen. And perhaps he hasn't been radicalised. Maybe he's now been freed from the kind of constraints of a Conservative party that was operating in a fairly functional way for at least the first 10 years of the 14 that they were in power. It was a sensible political organisation that put limits on him, and maybe this is what he really believes. And if that's true, then no wonder Kasumu is concerned in that way.
Well, Badenoch's response to Kasumu was, this nonsense of attacking anyone with a different viewpoint as divisive has to stop. We must be free to have tough conversations, no matter how difficult they may be to hear. There's a lot of euphemisms going on there. Tough conversations about immigration always go in one direction, don't they? What would be tough is if a politician got up and said that actually immigration was a positive.
And look at all the
that
financial, economic benefits it has. And here's a load of academic
but that's
research
so hard
that
nobody actually does
that,
it. How have we reached the point where a black woman is more tolerant of that kind of racism than Edward Heath was 57 years ago?
That's an interesting question. I think she's two things. One is that she's sort of a product of the party in its current state, and the other is she's a product of her own like hyper-individualist ideas and policies. So the party doesn't have a core set of beliefs anymore. It doesn't have a core, a soul. And that is why it's absolutely lost power and is completely disintegrating. So there's kind of nothing for her to hold on to and represent. And so she's able to say these kind of wild things that seem really outlandish to us. But I think she's also quite uniquely blinkered, because if you read the full set of comments that she made, she didn't say she agreed with his perspective, but the party was, quote, under new leadership, and that she willing to have the difficult conversations, as you said. And we know that she's very much not uncomfortable with conflict. She really thrives on it personally. And I think she's very naive in this. I think she thinks she's projecting a kind of a sense of significant power and confidence in allowing these things to be said, but that is very naive. And I think, yeah.
It reminds me a little bit there of Zuckerberg now, that free speech and different viewpoints, you always know what they are, don't you? Like these days, if you went, oh yeah, I was talking to Dan the other day and he's he's really got some different viewpoints. And it wouldn't be like, oh, what, he's really into nationalisation. You'd know what was implied. Alison, this story began with Elon Musk, of course, especially his disgraceful attack on Jess Phillips as a rape genocide apologist, which led to death threats. And not only did no prominent Tories denounce it, at least immediately, it followed Liz Truss, that hadn't been reported as much on, I think, New Year's Day, where she'd accused Jess Phillips of being on the side of rapists and Islamists. And Starmer kind of alluded to this in his sort of impromptu speech the other day. In very harsh terms. Like, just if you're in the House of Commons, you'll have met a lot of MPs in your career. I mean, how should Labour MPs react to a party that chooses to side with a foreign billionaire rather than the integrity and, frankly, safety of a fellow MP, a colleague in Westminster?
I do think this is one of the most shocking things that's happened, in that I think it's shone a light on how much things are changing within Westminster and within our political debate nationally. In that if you think, 10 years ago, I'm sure if anybody had said that about a sitting MP, there would have been a real sort of sense of solidarity amongst politicians working together, many of whom have close friendships across the floor, would have come out. But I think what we're actually seeing is people who are very terrified that they might be the next victim of an Elon Musk late at night diatribe. And they've been too scared to come out and pledge support. And also because I think the polarisation that we're seeing in society is being reflected within the chamber as well, that I think it's this terrible situation where common decency and what is acceptable, what the parameters of that debate seem to be being lost. And I think that's an interesting thing generally. There's lots of things that we used to sort of talk about, common decency or the common discourse, with the idea that there was a central set of ideas and there's a central set of things that were acceptable. Now that idea seems to be sort of terribly old-fashioned. And I thought when you saw Jess Phillips, she was interviewed last night on Channel 4 News, and I think she was on Newsnight as well. I thought it was quite a different Jess Phillips to the one that I've met many times, in that she seemed, I felt, quite shaken. You got to remember, this is a woman who was very good friends with Jo Cox, who was murdered in the run-up to the Brexit referendum. She knows all too well, and also she had that horrendous experience in the last election as well in her own constituency. She knows all too well how words can have the most horrendous real world consequences. And I think that has really been brought to her vividly again.
And how do you think the media has handled this story? I mean, I was really struck. A very long segment on The World at 1 on Tuesday. And an expert pointed out that only 3% of all child abuse cases involve organised networks. And the majority of that 3% are families. So actually grooming gangs are less than 2% of child abuse cases. That was not something that I knew otherwise. And I wonder whether the way that across the BBC and the press is that because Elon Musk said the thing, then it all becomes a kind of, well, do we need another inquiry? What's going on? What's going on here? Everybody is talking about this, that kind of. And obviously, as a former editor, you do have to reflect what people are talking about. But has it been sufficiently contextualised,
I had that interview as well, and it was absolutely fascinating. It was a senior police officer,
yeah.
and it wasn't even it's 3%, but of the gangs, grooming gangs, are still the offence is happening within a domestic situation.
And Sarah Montague was actually had to get him to say it again because she thought she'd misunderstood the percentages.
It was extraordinary, and so I think there is a wider problem in the media in that. A lot of reporting has become sort of a bit cartoonish, a bit Tom and Jerry, he said, she said, where's the drama, where's the action? There's a reason for that, because the way that digital algorithms work and people that they're making money, we are making money quite often out of the clicks, out of the interest. And so sort of some kind of long explanation into the facts and figures and the long-term trends around child sexual exploitation isn't necessarily going to get as much traffic as a he said, she said, quick hot take from somebody. I think we all, as journalists, I think this year is the time we need to have a good long, hard look at ourselves, because what is going to differentiate journalists from the wild west of social media is coming back to the place where you can get facts, where you can get context, where it's not all editorialised to the point of comment. And I think we need to kind of try and create some clear water. The problem with that, of course, is it's not necessarily as commercially rewarding as some, Punch and Judy politics.
Jonn, on the Today programme, Nick Robinson ruthlessly and entertainingly called out Jenrick's hypocrisy, pointing out that he did nothing about child abuse while in government, never mentioned it in Parliament, nor had Badenoch, if you search through Hansard. The Tories also rejected a new inquiry and failed to act on the last one by Alexis Jay. And the Jay report actually praised Starmer as DPP for changing the rules to make it easier to prosecute grooming gangs. So what are the Tories playing at? Like, where is the substance to this attack?
I mean, there isn't any. There isn't any. That's why you
It's a
set
trick
it up
question.
like that. It's like, I mean, the Jenrick interview was incredible, wasn't it? Because the thing that really struck me about it was he had not considered that somebody may ask him these questions.
Yeah.
This is my so the main thing I find because I mean he is a terrifying figure. The main thing reassuring me that I don't think he's going to go all the way at any point is he is quite bad at some of the basics, such as, for example, foreseeing that if you're going to attack the government on this 6 months after you've left office, someone is going to think to look up what you did when you were a minister in the Home Office. That might come up at some point, and it has clearly not occurred to Jenrick that this might happen. And there's all sorts of stuff around. Obviously the Tories play on easy setting with the media and so on. But nonetheless, I mean, is there any substance? To the extent that there is substance, is clearly some terrible things have happened that we should as a society be trying to deal with, which was the whole point of having the Jay inquiry in the first place. Some of the shockings in there are truly horrifying. And clearly there were things, it does seem like there were things that were not being reported because people were slightly scared that they were going to be called racist if they said actually there is a problem in a specific community. That is a problem. That is something that we need to work out how to address as a society, and it's also a problem for a particular community. Even now, you notice I'm mincing my words because this stuff is very ingrained. I'm being incredibly careful how I say this. So there is a real problem here, and it's true that the Labour government came in and did not immediately press the button on implementing those recommendations. A government has to prioritise. Top of its intro was not deal with the Jay report recommendations. It was thinking about other things. But that, as far as I can tell, is as far as the real substance
But there's a fetishisation of new inquiries. So the Tories could say, implement the recommendations, right? I think that would be a legitimate thing to say. But instead, they're calling for an inquiry would actually slow down the child safety bill because of its second reading. So any amendment would slow it down. And also because Badenoch hasn't actually met any of the victims. So they're talking about, don't you care about the children? I don't see where any of this is helping them.
Of course it isn't. And one of the other big political stories of the last few days is the Labour government actually doing something quite shameful and cowardly, I think, of saying it's going to set up another inquiry into the social care system and how we fix that. That is an inquiry that everybody knows is going to be used to kick an issue into the long grass so that they don't have to take the politically difficult decisions that we all know are necessary to fund the social care system. So it is extremely weird that on the one hand we've got the government is setting up an inquiry as a way of not dealing with an issue, as the opposition tells it to set up a completely different inquiry as a way of dealing with an issue.
The opposition has also made exactly that point about the social care inquiry. So you can't have it both ways.
They are just being led by what they think will get them retweets.
But then I think number 10, has indicated this afternoon they're not completely opposed to the idea of an inquiry at some point. And I actually think it's so unfortunate this becomes a political issue because there are a huge number of people in this country now who think an inquiry would root out something. It would seem to me, what about, we implement the J recommendations straight away, but then as well, we're going to look at something else. We could sort of say, how did we as a society get to this point? How did it happen? Because I think the big problem we have at the moment, which is what's creating these great divisions in our society, is there is a significant chunk of people who think they're not being listened to and they're being told by the people in power, just go over, we don't care what you think, just go away. And somehow we've got to say that, yes, we are listening to those concerns and these concerns are being addressed. But unfortunately, the way that politics works, if Starmer comes out and says that now, it'll look like he's capitulated. And that's a problem.
Well, Nigel Farage annoyed Musk by holding the line against Tommy Robinson. I mean, he then sort of continued to suck up to Musk. So let's not give him too many points here. But he has always tried to distance his parties from EDL. It's all one party, really, isn't it? Just keeps changing its name. From EDL-style street violence and avert race baiting and sort of maintain a veneer of respectability. Like, I am not Tommy Robinson is one of his big political messages. And yet Jenrick sounds like Tommy Robinson. So are the Tories actually in danger of, and I wouldn't have said that, I think, before the last few days, of sort of leapfrogging Farage to the right, at least on some issues?
I absolutely think so. I actually think Nigel Farage handled it extremely well this week in terms of his sort of hopes for the next election, and that he's created some sort of clear blue water between himself and the Conservatives. There was a great line I heard, I think it was Timothy Garton-Ash said yesterday, is why vote for the dog whistle when you can have the dog? So a lot of people now be thinking, well, why would I bother voting for the Conservatives where I can actually go straight to reform? Because actually, on this particular issue, they appear to have been more reasonable. And there's already a significant number of people thinking, why exactly would I be voting Conservative? So those people on the left of that party will go to maybe the Lib Dems, they might go to Labour, and those people on the right are just walking straight into the arms of Nigel Farage.
Well, Hannah, you'd expect this from the absolute shits. But some of the supposedly sensible people, right? Chris Philp was mealy-mouthed. I think he did a sort of eventually turned around and went, actually, no, you probably shouldn't call Jess Phillips that. James cleverly seemed more angry with Starmer, and he tweeted...
That was really weird.
And also very ungrammatically. Accusing those who disagrees with him or who seeks legitimate answers about repeated failures of child protection as far right is deeply insulting and counterproductive. Proofread your tweets cleverly. And then Tim Stanley, whatever he is now... was just like, oh, Starmer cares more about Jess Phillips than he does about rape victims, which is, again, just a horrendous thing to say.
And a completely insane thing to say about Jess Phillips as well.
Who has done so much more work than I would imagine Tim Stanley has. What has happened to all these supposed moderate Conservatives? I mean, is there anything left of the one, whatever you call it, One Nation or the Sensibles or the people that weren't particularly mad about Brexit? Like, what's happened?
They've all been cowed out. They're all running scared. Anyone who has survived, in fact, there's hardly anyone who survived the last election, but those that have are just, they don't know what to do, I think, and they're just saying nothing until a point where they feel that it's opportune again. But the danger there is that I get very frustrated when I hear people say Farage isn't up to the job, that he'd never be future Prime Minister, because he has proved this week that he is an exceptional politician. He knows exactly where to pitch himself at every point to secure and continue his rise or whatever his current focus is. So you'll notice he doesn't talk about Brexit at all, really, anymore. And that's because the country has generally moved on from that. There is a sort of tacit understanding that it was a load of old bollocks, but we're stuck with it now. He's stopped talking about it. He's removed his persona from the Brexit man. He's now something else. He's about British identity, British values, immigration. He's divorced Brexit from immigration, which at the time he made one issue. He has, this week, seemed like a centre-right politician, which is really worrying because he isn't, and yet he's starting to look like one.
So what I don't understand really is how the Tories ended up here, because obviously Boris Johnson purged a bunch of rebel Remainers in 2019, but it wasn't that, I mean, it was the most prominent ones, but it wasn't like that huge a percentage, of the Parliamentary Conservative Party. And it didn't have the, immediate effect of making everybody sound like Tommy Robinson. So what is going on now?
Well,
most of
them lost their seats.
So is it just a post-defeat? But what's affecting the kind of the reasonables, alleged reasonables, who haven't lost their seats? Is this just post-election meltdown?
I mean, it feels like you don't get on in the Tory party by being a reasonable centrist type. So I think it's a sort of evolutionary mechanism, isn't it? Like, I mean, you were talking about what's happened to Jenrick. I think one of the things is that people are quite good at persuading themselves of the things that will help them personally. So I think one explanation for how Jenrick has ended up where he has is it's the most politically advantageous thing to believe, and thus he came to believe it. I think you're seeing this with quite a lot of the Tory party. I also think the media is a huge factor. Like I bang on about this a lot, I know, but like once upon a time, if you read all the newspapers, you would have a sense of the range of views in Britain because, everyone was picking up one of them or another. Whereas now, like newspapers are read by a relatively small proportion of the population, generally older, generally, reasonably settled. So they're not reflecting the balance of opinion anymore. Like once upon a time, Rupert Murdoch had to at least vaguely sort of look at what people thought when deciding which way to nudge his editors, whereas now the papers don't have to do that. But I'm not sure that message has necessarily reached the Tory front bench, where they still kind of look at the front of the Telegraph, they see it on the newspaper reviews, they see it leading the agenda on the Today programme, and they think that is what people care about. And it's just kind of become detached from the actual views of the electorate. And I think what's happening with like following Elon Musk on Twitter is kind of the level beyond that, where it's not even pretending to be in touch with people, but because this is the dominant discourse on an important media platform, they're thinking, well, there must be votes here.
But does it make political sense? Because Musk is deeply unpopular with the British public. I think it's about 20% like him. As are the views that fueled the riots last summer, and even half of Reform voters, really have contempt for the far right. If you look at the polling there, only half of Reform is like the darkest version. So where are the votes? If there are votes here, then those votes belong to Reform. Like, where are they going with this?
Well, I don't know if you noticed, Dorian, but the Conservatives did lose the last election quite badly.
Is it because they're bad at politics?
I think they might be bad at. I do genuinely think, like, because they have been kind of playing on this easy setting for so long, they've not had to get good at this. They've not had to be in touch with the public. So they've kind of developed their own little ecosystem in which they're just going around convincing each other of stuff. And because it's getting a good reception on the socials,
saying that this is tough.
It's true.
And also flattering themselves by going, well, this is a tough conversation.
Yeah.
It's like, it seems to be the easiest thing you could possibly do is go further right. And what would actually be tough would not be doing what the Telegraph comment page wants you to do.
And it's not going to work because the only way that party is coming back to government is to win back quite a lot of votes who, some went to Labour, but a lot went to the Liberal Democrats. In like the affluent commuter towns of the south of England, if they want to retake those seats, they've got to be winning like the Gales belt again. And you're not going to do that by aping Nigel Farage.
So on your end, on a couple of questions I find quite unnerving. Jonn, the worry is, like, the reason that I think I held back from wishing that the Tories were just wiped out like Canada 1993 was that, oh God, well, if it's not them, then it's Farage, right, on the right. But is there a reason this week to assume that a future Tory government would be better than a Farage-led government?
Oh God, there's a question. I mean, I actually think, yes, there still is, in that the argument that was made a lot on the centre-left when Jeremy Corbyn was in charge is like, he is not the whole party. And to be fair, some of the left have made that argument the other way around, saying Starmer is not the whole party. Sure. It's like there is a whole infrastructure of MPs and activists and councillors and supporters and so on.
And to have the kind of numbers you'd need to build a government again, it would necessitate a broad church that would mean that you could draw on that for cabinet and so on.
Despite what Elon Musk seems to think, Reform is not a proper party. It's the Nigel Farage show at the moment. Now, that could change. But at the moment, it's one guy with some people behind him.
It is changing, though, quite quickly, I think.
I mean, it could do.
And I think what happens is, as with all things, there's a tipping point, isn't there? So something like, a year or so ago, people wouldn't necessarily admit that they were going to vote Reform. But when you get to the tipping point where enough people are saying, oh, well, I've joined and I've joined, then it becomes okay to say it. And then it gets a momentum all of its own. And it's going to get money.
Yeah. Weirdly, one of the best things that could happen to the Conservative Party probably is generic switching to Reform, because then Baynard would have to push against it and come back somewhere towards the centre.
Yeah, I hoped Braverman was going to do it, but she hasn't yet, has she?
I did enjoy that speculation because, nobody was begging her not to.
And her husband's gone as well.
Yeah,
so.
Her husband did go, which she's the lefty in the house. So Hannah, I mean, I co-wrote with Ian Dunt this origin story book on fascism, and what you learn is that history shows that the far right prevails really only when the centre-right enables it. It's not ultimately about about what's happening on the left. I mean, but if the left is divided, that really doesn't help. But it needs the centre-right to sort of allow it. You see that in proportional representation systems across Europe. You know, do they keep out the extremists or do they let them into the coalition? So we almost, maybe without thinking about it, have we been reliant on this sort of a Tory firewall against extremism on the right? And that it seems that maybe just might not exist anymore.
I think that's very fair, but the firewall exists on both sides of the political spectrum. So that's kind of what centrism is built on, isn't it? This idea that there's a common set of values in the centre and that the governments on the left and the right oscillate around it somewhat, and a common set of values of any country.
But nobody's been scared of the far left.
But some people in this country
In
have.
Britain.
That's where these Telegraph editorials come
No, but I mean,
from.
like, seriously, we are not seeing the far left take power or make inroads. And
No, but I think
haven't
people
done.
I think that some people had a genuine fear of that, by the way. I don't think that's I don't think it's inaccurate to say that some people wrongly had a fear of it, which motivated the kind of rise of what we now are calling the far right in this country. So I think the firewall still exists very significantly on the left now, because we've got a really functioning Labour Party and a government that's actually doing something, a centre-left Prime Minister, but it's collapsed on the right. Anyway, positive. 2025, everyone.
Does anyone want to put a positive spin on this, or should we just end it there? Just end it with a moment of quiet contemplation. Next up, 2025 is shaping up to be a rough year, with Labour on the back foot, a gibbering authoritarian in the White House, and tech billionaires running wild. There's lots to discuss and watch out for, so we thought we'd take as many questions as we can, submitted by our esteemed Patreon backers. Let's begin. Are we ready?
Yeah, let's go.
Going to start with a light one from Josh. Have any of the panellists ever committed to a New Year's resolution that has continued to impact how they live their lives today? Alison?
Never. However, that doesn't mean that I don't keep trying every single year. So it's optimism over experience every single time. So this time I'm trying to exercise every day-ish, and I'm learning Latin on Duolingo.
Wow, that's brilliant.
Yeah, I've got a 9-day streak. Anything could happen. But it won't last. Obviously it won't last.
So in terms of impacting your life, almost every single year, my New Year's resolution is finish the novel that I'm writing, but it isn't finished. So this year, that's my resolution again, and it's still impacting my life. Yes, it's never done.
Last year, I decided in January I should sort my health out a bit, and I started going to the gym a couple of times a week, and I have stuck to that. It's not made me any slimmer. I am just slightly more muscular under the fat, but nonetheless, that's something.
I don't do New Year's resolutions. My resolution every year is just keep on trucking. Keep going. You're doing a great job. Keep it up. No, I just felt like basically that classic thing of then you do it and then you fail. And I used to have like a to-do list, which went from the very easy, like tidy desk, all the way up to like learn French, find new career.
That's on everybody's list as well. Yeah.
And every year I just look at them and just going, no, I've just failed again. So then I just kind of just thought, do you know what? It's hard enough just doing the normal stuff and having a family and having a job and trying to be a decent friend and all of that. And so I've got very sort of abstract with my New Year's resolutions, so I can never fail.
You're absolutely right. We should also liberate ourselves from expectation, but I just struggle to do that.
Well, look, now, when you're talking fluent Latin by the end of the year, you're the one that's going to be winning.
When you're the first female pope.
Yeah.
My son has a 2-year streak every single day on Duolingo.
Amazing.
Wow.
He's like 13 and he's 2-year streak and he's fluent in French. And so he shames me.
That's very impressive.
Very good.
Now the listeners can shame you as well.
Yeah.
Everyone can shame me. Steve Edwards. I work in the energy industry and can see Labour making progress. I can see them also moving on housing and the NHS. I also hear a lot of frustration about other policy areas. Are the government giving themselves the best chance of landing delivery over 4 years? Basically by focusing on the right things. Hannah?
They are focusing, I think, on the areas that are causing the most damage to people's lives. So health, NHS, housing, and also energy, because obviously the cost of energy is huge. All three are directly causing poverty, and poverty is obviously always a drain on economic growth as well. So I think that's the reason they've picked those three, and I think it's very sensible. And it's great to see they're actually doing something. And of course, we never hear enough about it.
I would point to a different reason that those three areas are actually seeing activity is they've all got quite energetic activist secretaries of state. It doesn't feel like there is sort of an overarching mission from this government. It's very managerial in its approach, and it's an open question as to how much that matters. But I do suspect one of the reasons where we're seeing more activity in certain areas than others is just because, like, which ministers are most confident about essentially going out there and freelancing in their own policy area.
Did you see that appalling quote from an unnamed Labour source where he goes, the only minister that really knows how to get things done is Ed Miliband, and he's the last person we want to succeed if we're going to win the next election.
It was
very much just like, we need to let the planet burn in order to win the next election. I was like, I don't know, man, maybe you're not in the right party.
I think you've got a point there, John, because I think Wes Streeting is very one-track mind. If I fix the NHS, I will get to be Prime Minister, which, is probably true.
Really? Do you think he's ambitious? I think he keeps it very quiet. What aspects of Labour's conduct in government thus far have surprised you, whether pleasantly or otherwise? I would say that I thought that they would be better at it. I thought that perhaps that they talked a lot about, remember, Sue Gray, and she's planning for what they do in government, and they seem to be surprised by a lot of things. I don't really care about the freebie scandal and stuff like that, but I felt like the whole story we were being told was they're ready to kind of, race off the blocks on day one. And they very much weren't. And I still don't really understand why. And it doesn't mean that I can't see the progress they're making and think that things will get better. But I think that was a bit of a shock.
The pitch was very much we're going to be hyper competent. And if that's your pitch, you kind of have to then be competent.
It's like a New Year's resolution. That's why I never promised to be hyper competent.
And growth. There was so much talk about growth, wasn't there, in the run-up to the election. And then since then, A, it hasn't been spoken about as much, and then B, you'll have people criticising the budget. And I think what growth, although it can sound quite boring, I think, to some of the voters, I think what it does give you is an overarching theme, is that we're all going to feel better off. The country will be better off. We'll be able to afford more of the things that we need. And it kind of gives a sort of a yellow brick road to follow. And I think it's very odd that somehow got lost.
I think Starmer was also pretty impressive in the first 2 weeks. That first speech seemed to be really like that he'd been liberated from the, restraints of opposition. He sounded really confident. He looked like literally a bigger man, like standing there. And then it was quite exciting when he just chucked out all the rebels in the first week. I was like, this is going to be great. And then that has not continued. It's been kind of depressing to see the withering of the man with the stress of the job.
Actually, this is something that surprised me. Is like a lot of the critiques of Starmer from the left, I think, have turned out to be more accurate than I'd given them credit for. Like, there are clearly people in the top team who do think their priority should be to kick the left. And this is something that a lot of people on the sort of more Corbynite wing have always said, and I just thought they were being ridiculous, and actually it no longer looks like that to me.
Hippie punching is the word that I like there. Yeah, no, they're very into that. Alison, here's one from Eddie Hutton Mills. If more truth and more information from the left isn't the answer to combating the right-wing appeal to irrational emotions and alternative facts, what is? And you mentioned earlier that this whole kind of vogue for fact-checking after 2016 has kind of faded, and people are actually going, well, does this work? So what is a better approach?
So I think you do still need truth and you do need facts, because we're going to have to. We do need something that whilst there are some people on the edges of everything, there is still a significant chunk of sensible people in the middle who still want facts and they still want truth, and we need to have that we can coalesce around. But what everybody needs is stories that are told with an emotional value to engage people who, we've got to remember that most people, the kind of people probably not listening to this podcast, who aren't reading the Telegraph or they're not reading anything, their intake of news every day is very, very small. And so you've got to find a way of going to those people where they are and catering to their requirements where they are in a language that they feel comfortable with, by journalists who they feel they can identify with. So if you look at kind of like how effective influencers are on TikTok, they're called influencers because they influence. Do journalists influence in the same way? Not necessarily. And I think we've got to really reimagine how we take the messages that we feel as a democracy we need the public to hear and work out more effective ways of getting them out there.
I'm so pleased to hear you say that, because I've written something very similar here and I thought everybody would be going, oh my God, what are you saying? But I've written here lifestyle politics, i.e. creating like community and political engagement as part of like a healthy life, wellness and all of that, because that is what people want to engage with. They want to think about themselves, bluntly. And if you don't make politics about them in a way that's accessible, with people who feel accessible, journalists who feel accessible and normal and not like extremely posh and living a completely different life, then they're not going to listen.
And there's also, there's also sort of big issues, I think, around the collapse in local journalism, which I think was the most trusted form of journalism. And because of course the big tech companies have sucked all the advertising revenue out of that and everything else, I think we've lost that sense that news and journalism matters. And actually, I think there's an even bigger problem than misinformation and disinformation, which is disinterest. The big issue is huge numbers of people are just turning off from the news completely because they cannot stomach the fighting and the arguing and the wars and the misery. And that is where real trouble lies. As you'll have known from the work you've done on fascism, it's that Hannah Arendt point, isn't it? That, the perfect target for totalitarianism isn't on the extreme left or on the extreme right. It's the person in the middle who just doesn't know what to believe anymore. And that's the worry.
So relatedly, I think we're now getting into perhaps unlikely scenarios. Jonn, Edward Bloomfield, how likely is it that the UK government will ban Twitter, which he refuses to call X, like it banned RT?
It doesn't feel very likely to me at the moment. I mean, if they're not even willing to say there are some problems with foreign billionaires injecting hundreds of millions of dollars into British politics, I just don't see them kind of like taking the sort of hit for. It would be seen as an attack on free speech. It would annoy a lot of the right of British journalism is still by and large on Twitter.
But I think it would be an attack on free speech.
I mean,
because RT, it was a state broadcaster specifically designed to pump Russian propaganda throughout the world. X is a platform dominated by a certain political faction. But there's also lots of other stuff on there. It's not the same thing.
It's increasingly difficult to find it, though.
No, but, it's still got many millions of users, and it is not explicitly like a far-right mouthpiece.
No, you're not wrong. Sorry, I'm not really disagreeing. But I have been shocked by how completely... I've been shocked by my own behaviour, how completely I've disengaged from Twitter. It hasn't been a huge part of my life for... 15 years, like a huge chunk of my life. Like I've made many of my friends there. I have the career that I have now because of Twitter, and I was in mourning about what it would mean and I just don't look at it anymore.
Yeah,
because I don't get the engagement.
I was the same after about a week after I moved to Blue Sky. I was like, I don't give a shit about Twitter, and I go back every now and then, and I have basically zero notifications.
Well,
and everything is horrible.
The same.
If your network moves, it's not relevant.
But I think what you're observing is that our network has moved. And so I've also moved to Blue Sky, and actually I've built a better community there in about 3 months than I did over a decade and a half on Twitter, 2 decades. But the issue is that for the majority of British users, whether you're a small business or just connecting with your friends, they're not seeing what we see because they're not using it politically and they never have done. And I just don't think it is the cesspit that we see and that has made us completely disengaged for the majority of users.
I should also say that, as Mark Zuckerberg sort of, points out, that attempts to... He was kind of threatening the EU and UK and so on. If they try to regulate social media companies, they would be punished by the American government. So it's not as if you could, even if they wanted to ban, and there was an ethical case for banning X, that Elon Musk would just go, oh, well. Like, it seems like that would also be an extremely dangerous thing to do. Anyway, in other probably won't happen news, Lindsay Wade asks, is it time to rejoin the single market and tell Trump and Musk to go to hell? I mean, you can tell them to go to hell. That's fine. Is it time to rejoin the single market? Any possibility of this?
No possibility, but yes, it would be great. I just realism tells me no, it's not going to happen.
I agree. I mean, I think it's the only. I think it's sometimes the plausibility of it is underplayed in that we do still have a lot of advantages that would be useful to Europe. Like we do have quite a big military, we have the bomb, we do have a financial centre, even if it's not what it used to be. Like there are cards we could play which were not played very well during the Brexit negotiations, but I think with like everything going on to the east of Europe at the moment, I think it would be easier to kind of make some kind of agreement around a defence pact in exchange for but a lot of things would have to happen before anyone in Brussels wants to have that conversation.
I know, it's very disappointing for our rejoined listenership, but it's just like, I'm not trying to be mean. I'm just not seeing the opportunities yet. Okay, talking of things related to Russia, David Hawkins says on NATO defence spending, he says he's basically questioning whether we should have our defence spending dragged up by the USA's overspend. The USA invests a disgusting amount of money in defence to advance its own priorities. And basically, should we be emulating that?
I think we do need to put more money into defence spending. I think we're an incredibly difficult time globally, and I think we need to be able to show to Putin that we do take this seriously. And also, I can actually see Trump's point, or I can imagine if I was some, the gasoline worker in Kentucky or somewhere, and I'm thinking, hang on a minute, why am I putting all this money? Why is my money going in towards NATO when elsewhere in Europe people aren't contributing to the same extent? So I think there is some sense, and I think just generally, if Trump does one thing in his 4 years ahead, it brings some realism into some of the conversations. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think we need to question everything we do and things that have just sort of become the norm. I think we need to, particularly on the left, we need to articulate why we think it's a good reason rather than just accepting that, oh, yeah, that's how it's always been.
I just think that we have had it where you've been able to rely on, US sort of military shield. And you just can't, because it's revealed itself to be not the country we thought it was. And it's being led by a madman, and you just can't trust it. And therefore, you do have to spend more money. I don't understand it. I'm not somebody who loves the arms trade or anything like that. But I don't see how you could not do it. You can't do the 5%, which he's just said as basically a target, which is impossible for anyone to meet, at least in the short term. And this is more of his bullshit. But it does seem like if you cannot rely on America, then you are going to, and Russia is being very aggressive, then you're just going to have to. I don't really understand what the alternative is there.
I mean, I agree with everything everyone's said. The only thing I would add is I've sometimes wondered if there's a way of connecting this to the growth agenda, in that, in the past, countries have used rearmament to boost their economies. And it kind of feels like if we still had such a thing as an industrial strategy, maybe this could be part of the picture.
We do have one now. Labour has.
Is that actually happening?
Yeah, that is happening.
Maybe like rebuilding some manufacturing capacity as part of this would not be the worst thing in the world.
It's like the Elvis Costello song "Shipbuilding," but less wistful. It's a plan. Just literally an economic plan. What was the one? Alison, here's another media one. Ross Schonfeld. Can newspapers and print journalism continue to advance in their current form given declining circulation and generations growing up on digital media? Are we in an in-between period before the next big change? And he suggests a Spotify of news, which has, of course, been floated sort of many times. Like, what is the fate of print?
Well, print is going as we know it. Some titles will go sooner, some will hang on for maybe 10 to 15 years. But all kind of the print titles in this country have very solid digital presences. What worries me most is the division that we're seeing between those that have got a good, strong subscription model, where you've got things like the Times and the Telegraph, and then you've got the sort of philanthropy model at the Guardian, which works very well as well for them. And then you've got sort of the more popular end of the market, the Mirror where I work, the Sun, the Mail, where their digital offering is entirely based around advertising. Now, that causes all sorts of problems because it gets to the point where really you're just talking about volume, because the way that the digital advertising market works is that Google takes something like 90% of all the revenue, which means that the money left to do proper journalism is negligible. And that actually the only thing is that it's all about volume, isn't necessarily the kind of content you always want to be creating. And the concern I really have is that we could reach a point where you'll get a very educated, informed elite who are prepared to pay for news, and then you'll get the mass market who won't be getting good quality news, and that's the worry.
It's also it's very hard to read. Like, one of the reasons why I'm kind of really do want print to survive, at least certain publications, is because a lot of time the digital version is like a bombardment of ads and pop-ups and sidebars. It's very hard to find that sort of, by comparison, even just a regular newspaper, even a magazine that isn't particularly good, well designed, it's like this beautiful artifact because it's not just like throwing crap at you while you're halfway through an article.
And if there was a fairer deal for publishers from Google and Facebook so that they were getting paid the proper advertising that their content, they wouldn't need to have as many adverts. It's big tech have just bulldozed their way through and doing exactly what they want, and the nation states have been so slow to wake up to what was coming down the line.
The other thing that really disappointed me, so I was at the Independent when we shut the newspaper and left after a few years as a digital-only product, and you can make your conclusions about that. But I think what I was really disappointed about was that the Independent didn't try a weekly edition.
Yes,
that was considered. I know that I wasn't involved in the meetings about it because I was only a section editor, not in the top sort of 3 editors. But there were discussions about it. It was seriously looked at as a proposal to have a daily online, 24-hour news team and producing a kind of maybe even glossy but like really good quality weekly edition to rival the Sundays, or maybe on a Saturday, or maybe even on a Friday. But they just couldn't make the numbers stack up.
But that is one area that is growing, I think, those weekly titles. And
I think I was going to say it's interesting that Tortoise and the Observer deal, that is partly because Tortoise really feels it needs that kind of prestige of that print title.
And the London Standard, which is wretched but does exist.
It's awful, though.
I mean, it's awful, but it does exist.
But for me, that was a real sadness. I was really excited about that idea, and when it didn't come to pass, I was very disappointed.
And there might be some interesting things. There's a lot of talk now that people still want a digital detox. They might want to read something in print, and it might be that you stock it in bookshops rather than in newsagents. So we might need to reimagine what that looks like.
I just feel like, and I know that might perhaps age and a certain Luddite tendency is showing here, but it just seems like every day I'm just seeing about like, wow, we really should not have trusted big tech. Wow, that really is an incredibly destructive force. And then people just going, but all our journalism is going to move online. And it's like, have we not? That used to maybe sound quite kind of utopian back in the day, and now it just seems nightmarish. Where it just seems like, well, I guess there's nothing you can do about that.
I mean, to bring it back to kind of Zuckerberg and Meta and so on, it's interesting because. There was a period of time where Facebook really did claim to want to be part of newspapers as they were. There were meetings that were really genuinely serious about involving, bringing audience to news and news being taken very seriously. And then now we know where it's gone. And it's very easy with hindsight to say none of those meetings were meaningful, but they didn't feel that way at the time. So I don't think you can entirely blame publishers.
No, I think social media was a long con. I do. I think this was where it was headed, and they just kind of fluffed up a load of stuff about bringing people together and working hand in hand with traditional media. And now Zuckerberg, like this announcement, he's just like, oh yeah, no, none of that.
Yeah, Musk and Zuckerberg make the kind of the old publisher magnates of old look like pussycats. I mean, these are proper bad people.
Bring back.
Yeah,
Beaverbrook.
Yeah.
Maybe not Rothermere, an actual fascist, but Beaverbrook. Sally Bean, a lot of people probably want to cast protest votes in the next election. Apart from reform, they could go for the Lib Dems or the Green Party. Obviously not just protest parties. What should the two progressive parties be doing to make sure they increase their profile and number of seats in the next election? Because this is the thing, of course, is that the Lib Dems had a whole load of seats, and the Green Party did very well as well. But all the energy is around reform. I don't see people constantly asking what the Lib Dems are up to. Any tips?
The Lib Dems are actually really good at this. I mean, like, they had an amazing result. They won almost all of their target seats. Ed Davey, who was, let's not forget, a minister in the coalition and was not a million miles away from the post office scandal at certain points, managed to completely launder his reputation as kind of, the lovable dad who really cares about social care, which, he sincerely does. So I think the Lib Dems are probably going to do quite well. The Greens, I'm less convinced on. I mean, they've done brilliantly from where they started. I do think they have a slight issue with being very different. I mean, all the parties are coalitions, obviously, but I think the Greens have not yet kind of like worked out what it means to be a coalition between, on the one hand, quite, lefty urban people who think that the Labour Party are a bunch of sellouts, and on the other, a group of people I can only describe as tree NIMBYs. Rural conservatives who maybe don't like where the Conservative Party has gone, but really like green space, but don't want any houses there or a pylon. And those two wings have completely different issues, completely different opinions on things. And I do wonder whether that could cause problems somewhere down the line. Having said that, this was kind of also true of the Lib Dems in the noughties, and it worked out fine for them.
Well, I'm just going to say I think the Lib Dems are facing the same problems now, actually. So the Lib Dems have gone very hard in those areas of kind of Oxfordshire and so on, where they've secured seats for the first time on things like NIMBYism. And yet, if they want to hold together the coalition that they have, they actually can't be anti-house building for very long. So I think they will trip themselves up a little bit. They've got to decide what they want to be. Do they want to kind of have some kind of alliance with the Greens and Labour and keep the far right out, or are they just going to chase very hard the centre right?
Finally, from Susan Fraser, can you give us any politically related reasons to be cheerful in 2025? I can't, so I'm going to ask everybody else to.
I can, but you've got to think about politics globally. So, we've had some new stats at the end of last year, which were finished in 2022 as the last data set, published at the end of last year. Global child deaths have reached an all-time low. Secondly, it's estimated that in 2024, China reached peak emissions, so we're actually heading downwards on emissions. Thirdly, the malaria vaccine rollout is now underway, which is going to save millions of lives, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And AI and medicine is very exciting. So, just one example, AI-enhanced fingerprint testing for Parkinson's can predict the disease 7 years before the onset of symptoms now. So it can be prevented by treatment. 4 things that should make you feel happy. They're all politics related. They are all politics related.
It's science being good. It's science being good.
Are you anti-science now, Dorian?
I like science being good, but I suppose I was thinking politically.
But it is political. It's all political in terms of, I think, big problem we've got politically at the moment is everyone is so depressed about everything that if we could find a way of putting a bit of hope into people's lives, everything might look a bit more hopeful.
I am quite depressed, so thank you. This is helping.
I'll come back with more next week.
Yeah, no, this is all good stuff. Jonn,
Oh God, I've got nothing on that level.
what have you got that will save millions of lives?
Well, I think there is some hope in, like, Labour are not doing brilliantly, but I do think we have a government now which has its heart is often in the right place. I'm not sure I would have said that at the beginning of last year. I think going back to the question about the single market, I think probably our medium-term trajectory is to move back closer to Europe. I don't think we're going back into the single market anytime soon, but I do think that's the direction we're going to go in. We are now only just over 4 years from the point where Donald Trump should leave office. So that's good. And also, I think possibly also another member of the panel have a book out in paperback later in the year. So that's nice.
That's certainly something to look forward to. And perhaps I think if you've written a book about stories at the end of the world, and you've also written the books about fascism and conspiracy theories, there is at least a certain topicality to the world in 2025. Which
won't be short of work, Dorian,
which might help if that's your beat.
So now the world doesn't actually end.
But I would rather sell fewer books and have a better world.
On balance.
Morally.
Yeah, okay.
I want to make that very, very clear. Alison.
Well, I'm with Jonn. I think that after a bit of a wobbly start to the new government, I think since the new year. I think, in a way, the whole Musk and the awful rape grooming gangs has given Keir Starmer a position on which he's come across as quite strong. I think the NHS stuff, which unfortunately has been slightly overshadowed this week, was good. And I think some of the Bridget Phillipson stuff, so she's doing around children in the schools, is good. And I think if they can keep up the momentum, because I think there's a real sort of attention deficit problem amongst the British public at the moment. So you just can't keep banging out the policies, banging out the ideas day after day after day, and hopefully they'll get there.
So that's the show. Thank you to Hannah,
Thank you.
Jonn,
Thank you.
and Alison.
Thank you.
Hang around for the extra bit after Demon is a Monster by Corner Shop, and a grateful salute to the supporters who keep the podcast going. You can join them for as little as £3 a month. Get the podcast early, without ads, bonus material, and lots more. Search Oh God What Now Patreon. We'll see you next time.